The United States maintains a military apparatus capable of projecting kinetic power into any theater on Earth within hours. To sustain this posture, the Pentagon funds a permanent network of over 750 forward operating bases, distributed across 80 sovereign countries. It is an infrastructure of global reach that dwarfs the logistics of the Roman and British empires combined. Yet, beneath the armor and the logistics networks lies a mathematical liability, a gross national debt currently exceeding $35 trillion. Maintaining absolute military supremacy while relying on an increasingly fragile, deficit-dependent economic base creates a persistent strategic tension. Evaluating the survival odds of a hegemon requires looking past the weapon systems to interrogate the ledger. Between the 2024 and 2025 fiscal years, the United States crossed a specific, quantifiable macroeconomic threshold. This chart tracks two distinct federal outlays over time. The blue line represents national defense spending, while the red line plots net interest outlays. For the first time in nearly a century, the cost of servicing the national debt eclipsed the entire base budget of the Department of Defense. The federal government spent $970 billion paying interest to bondholders, surpassing the $893 billion allocated to the military. Does this specific mathematical crossover guarantee the terminal decline of American global hegemony? To answer that, we must test this modern data against three established historical and macroeconomic frameworks of imperial collapse. Identifying historical patterns allows us to determine whether a modern superpower is experiencing a temporary economic slump or entering a systemic, irreversible failure. The first framework comes from British historian Paul Kennedy, who published a thesis in 1987 mapping the cyclical rise and fall of great powers. Kennedy termed this core concept Imperial Overstretch. Imperial overstretch describes the point where a nation's strategic obligations exceed its ability to generate wealth. The mechanism operates entirely through resource exhaustion. A nation acquires vast global commitments, overseas bases and defense treaties, and protracted foreign military interventions. These require continuous, high-cost military expenditures, which slowly drain the productive domestic economy that originally funded the expansion. Kennedy's LavFX chart shows an economic base contracting while military commitments climb. Applying this to the U.S. reveals a clear divergence. In 1960, America commanded 40% of the global economy. Today, that share sits at 24%, while overseas operations remain historic highs. Despite a relatively shrinking economic foundation, the architecture of American defense has only grown heavier and more expensive to maintain. Under Kennedy's model, the U.S. is trapped in a classic buns versus butter dilemma, diverting scarce domestic capital away from productive investments to fund a global empire on credit. While Kennedy focuses on broad historical structures, economic historian Niall Ferguson looks strictly at the fiscal arithmetic. Ferguson identifies a precise threshold that dictates geopolitical vulnerability, known as Ferguson's Law. The law states that a great power faces imminent geopolitical decline the moment it spends more on debt servicing than on national defense. This pie chart illustrates the zero-sum reality of a federal budget. The red wedge represents mandatory interest payments, a legally binding obligation. As it swells, it physically crowds out the blue wedge of discretionary defense spending, which remains the primary target for political cuts. This specific financial chokehold preceded the twilight eras of Habsburg Spain in the 17th century and Great Britain in the 1920s. Overwhelmed by debt accumulated during World War I, Britain was forced to freeze its military spending. At the Washington Naval Treaty, the British Admiralty abandoned its historic two-power standard of naval dominance to appease its creditors. Applying this covering law to the modern U.S. budget yields a grim trajectory. Nonpartisan projections from the Congressional Budget Office indicate interest costs will hit 4.1% of GDP by 2035, while defense spending stagnates. Crossing this threshold functions as a visible signal to rival powers. It demonstrates that the hegemon lacks the liquid capital required to defend its sphere of influence. Macroeconomic investor Ray Dalio focuses the analysis inward, examining domestic societal decay. Dalio outlines a big cycle that reaches a dangerous late peak stage when the economy hits debt saturation, the point where interest rates cannot be lowered further to stimulate growth. This circular diagram maps Dalio's macroeconomic model. The current U.S. position of holding debt exceeding 120 to 130% of its GDP places it squarely in the red decline phase. Faced with enormous unpayable burdens, central banks inevitably turn to quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is a monetary policy where a central bank creates new money to purchase government bonds, injecting liquidity into the financial system. This sustained money printing debases the fiat currency and triggers sharp asset inflation across real estate and equities. Asset inflation disproportionately benefits capital owners while destroying the purchasing power of the working class, widening the wealth gap. The wealth gap inevitably breeds extreme populism and deep systemic political polarization. Dalio's model argues that an empire rarely falls to a foreign army. It is paralyzed from the inside out by a gridlocked political system incapable of enacting fiscal reform. Kennedy's Overstretch, Ferguson's arithmetic, and Dalio's cycle are all currently flashing red for the United States. If the historical math is so catastrophic, the lack of an immediate U.S. economic collapse requires closer scrutiny. United States policymakers maintain an extended fiscal runway through the exorbitant privilege of dollar hegemony, the benefit derived from issuing the world's primary reserve currency. The entire global financial market, from Tokyo to London, operates entirely on an unbroken foundation of trust in the U.S. institutional system. Because global trade relies overwhelmingly on the dollar, and foreign central banks use U.S. treasuries as their primary safe asset, the rest of the world effectively subsidizes American borrowing. This creates a lock-in effect. Rival nations hold trillions in U.S. debt, meaning their own domestic economic stability requires them to prevent a dollar crash. This financial architecture provides the U.S. with an extended fiscal runway that collapsed empires like Spain or Britain never possessed. The modern era is defined by the slow-motion collision between compounding debt arithmetic and the institutional resilience of the dollar. The United States has entered a volatile transition phase where historical determinism meets institutional resistance. If political gridlock persists, the mathematical weight of compounding debt will eventually overwhelm the dollar's advantage, forcing a chaotic retreat from global commitments. Renewal remains a statistical possibility. While rivals like China face shrinking workforces, the U.S. population is projected to grow to 420 million by 2100. Simultaneously, model projections suggest generative AI could boost total factor productivity by 1.5% in the next decade, potentially adding enough economic activity to outgrow the debt. Time is rapidly running out on this deep structural imbalance, forcing a reckoning that cannot be delayed forever. History suggests that all hegemonies eventually contract. The ultimate test for the United States is whether it can enact the reforms necessary to manage a stable descent before the math forces a collapse.